Welcome to the Ratchetdavo podcast, episode 1, featuring myself, David, as Ratchetdavo on YouTube, and now beginning the adventure of podcasting. I appreciate anyone who is listening in, and if you're from my YouTube channel, I appreciate you following and subscribing over at my YouTube channel, and also following over to my podcast, which I am starting tonight. It is currently 3 a.m. and I'm finally beginning. I got together some audio equipment and using my GoPro as a camera, as I normally always do for almost everything I do in YouTube, which has been great and a reliable camera. So I'm excited to start podcasting for a few reasons. One being that I really want to tell stories and experiences that I've had in the automotive realm, as well as just being able to share, anything and everything on my thoughts on automotive related things, even related to motorcycles and trucks as well, but mainly focusing just on the automotive passion and hobby that I've come to know and love so much. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in, and I figured, what is the best thing to talk about when you're doing your first automotive style podcast? And I thought, none other than, if I'm doing a first episode, why not talk about my first car and first cars in general, and how that the first car that you have, or maybe that your dad has, or something of that nature, really just molds your outlook on the automotive world as you progress through your life, and molds your taste in vehicles, and how it just impacts your life in that sort of way. So I guess I'm just going to dive right in and just talk about my first car, but I kind of have to take a step back and kind of tell you the backstory on how I even got to my first car and why I chose this one. So growing up, we moved from the country to kind of more city area, and I remember one specific car across the street from my parents' house, and that was a 300ZX, a Nissan 300ZX. Excuse me. And the 300ZX, if you don't know much about it, was there was a couple models of the 300ZX starting in the 80s and newer body style going into the 90s. And this particular 300ZX came from the 90s. It was a Z32 chassis, and it was in the fire engine red. And I remember seeing this car, and I just loved the body lines of it. It just sat in my neighbor's driveway, and it just intrigued me so much. And I was just a nosy kid, so I would be running all over the neighborhood, but I would often find myself going back to that vehicle and just taking another peek or looking inside the windows or whatever. And it was just so cool to see that car, and it just immediately kind of caught my attention and caught my interest, aside from the fact that it's fire engine red, but that's besides the point. So I remember, I know my parents knew, I knew that I loved cars. I had so many Matchbox cars and Hot Wheels, and I had hundreds growing up, and cars just seemed to be a part of me growing up, although I can't say that my dad really had a car or anything like that really, nothing out of the ordinary from like the the early 2000s, like the Taurus or like the Impala or something that you would see almost like every other person drive. So it was really like, my dad didn't really have any vehicles that really caught my interest, but I knew that I really loved that body style. And it's so funny, I was actually able to find this book in my memory box in the garage, but my parents got me this book, and if you're watching on my YouTube channel, you can see it, but it's called Complete Handbook Supercars, Classics of Their Time, and the Z32 chassis 300ZX happens to be in this book, and my parents got this book for me. And it's so funny because I had cut the picture out, and then I taped it back in years ago, But they have a picture of the red 300ZX, just like the one across the street from my house growing up, that is there. And I read these 2 pages about the 300ZX over and over again, and I even have written in here in pencil $5,000, which I assume is the price that when my dad asked how much the neighbor would sell it for, that is kind of the price they put, which in my opinion, based on what I know now, I would probably not pay that much for a 300ZX unless it was extremely low miles. But regardless, that book and and that picture and then that car, I kind of set a goal in my mind. I was like, that is my first car. And the neighbor even let my dad drive the car. It was a 5-speed, it had the T-tops, and I was in the passenger seat. And I just remember, we didn't even drive fast or anything like that, but he just took it for a loop around the block. And excuse me, get some water here. And when he took it for a loop around the block, I just fell in love with it. The interior, the sound, that just distinct Nissan V6 sound with the dual exhaust. It was just so unique. And I was like, that's it. I was hooked, and that's got to be my first car. And so I was like, that was my goal. I had the $5,000 written in this book, and I was like, I'm going to save up for that car. And unfortunately, that car particularly did not become my first car. That neighbor moved away, and I never heard from that car or that neighbor ever again, and they took the car with them. So unfortunately, and I even tried to inquire about it later, and it's just, I never didn't have the right contact information to figure out where to find the car or anything like that. So unfortunately, that car kind of just went away. But I do remember years later, after that being kind of like in the back of my mind, I think I have had my learner's or driver's license. I can't remember which one it was, but my dad called my mom and put me on the phone with him, and he was on a business trip, and he wasn't that far away. He said he was on his way back, and he saw a 300ZX at a used car lot, and he called me, and he was like, hey, and our agreement was for my first car that he would pay for half of it and I would have to pay for the other half. And at that time, I didn't have the other half of the money. I wasn't making any money at that time. I was just too young. And he was like, I'll go ahead and buy it for you if you would like. It's at a price, I guess I don't even remember what the price was. And I guess he thought that price was good enough, and he was going to go for it. And he said, you just got to give me the okay. And I said, yes. I do remember him mentioning something about that it wasn't the Z32 chassis, but it was a 300ZX, and it was in red, like I kind of imagined in my mind my first car would be. And I said, okay, go ahead. And he purchased it from a used car lot somewhere, probably an hour from our home at that time, maybe 2 hours. And he sent it to a shop right down the road to get an oil change or something. And he left it there, and he was like, yep, I bought the car, and it'll be ready for pickup in a couple days. So obviously not sleeping for several days, we then went down there and got the car. And I remember it very distinctly, like that first time seeing my first car that I was going to be driving. And it was a burgundy red 1988 Nissan 300ZX, T-tops, 5-speed, the ones with the pop-up headlights, but you can still see half of the headlights even when they're down. I thought that was always such a unique look, and it's just everything 80s about it. T-tops and the cloth seats inside, and it just screamed. And the cool gauges on the dash. I mean, those cars were such cool cars, and it was so cool that was my first car, and I couldn't actually believe it. It was it's kind of crazy. And I just remember that drive back. I was so excited driving that car back that me and my dad had to pull over because I almost ran out of gas. I had to pull in some guy's driveway, and I was like, hey, do you have we asked if he had any gas, and he thankfully had a couple gallons of the correct fuel needed, and he willingly thank you to that old gentleman. Willingly gave us a couple of gallons of gas for free, and got us on our way. And that was it wasn't the Z32, but I still absolutely loved that car. I mean, it's your first car. I already knew I loved the 300ZX, and then just to get like the earliest body style, almost the earliest body style of the 300ZX, was such a cool experience and such a cool first car. But it really did mold my perspective on cars from there on out, because I mean, I to this day am passionate and love the Z car lineup and lineage, and the Datsuns and the Skylines. I mean, it really did impact my perspective on vehicles, and to this day I love anything Nissan, really. 300ZXs, and you know, I can admire a 240, and I love some of the newer stuff that Nissan is doing, and I'm excited to see what Nissan does with the 400Z, but I feel like that's like a whole video of itself if I really wanted to get into that. But you know, that first car is the one that you learn a lot about, and you break a lot of stuff, and you kind of learn as you go, and I definitely did that. And you know, I remember one of the first things I did was I messed around with, I got a muffler on the car. It wasn't straight piped or anything, but it was loud. I think I still have a video of that somewhere. And then, you know, you mess around with the cold air intake, just kind of like those basic modifications that as you start learning about cars, you're like, oh, this is advertised to make more power, you know, and you don't have to spend a lot of money on it. Regardless of if it does or not, you kind of mess around with it, and you know, you install that part on there, and then you take a hot lap. And I had this back road near my house, and that was where I did my hot laps, and that was just so cool. So I think I got one of my first automotive jobs. I ended up doing like a dual enrollment in school, and I went to automotive school in like my junior year of high school and senior year of high school I just didn't like normal high school, and I went and got my associate's degree, and but I remember during that time I still had the Z31 300ZX, and I was working at this parts yard / shop, but basically my job title was I was a unofficial stripper. And basically what I did was I stripped all the cars that came through, and my boss at the time, I mean, he salvaged literally everything about those cars, and he would, you know, even down to the copper wires, he wanted them stripped, and so that he could sell the copper and make money. So that was a unique experience, especially for a first automotive job. But that being said, he had parts. I mean, if he had stockpiled parts like crazy, you know, he had like a room full of door panels, or a pile of suspension springs, and then a whole yard full of very unique wheels and everything like that. So I remember it was mainly German cars that I worked at this place for. And I remember my boss allowed me to pick out some springs that I saw in the back that were like red, you know, mainly, if you know anything about automotive suspension, most of the time the springs, like the aftermarket stuff that you buy, is usually colored something other than black, which is normally the factory suspension. But I saw some red springs in the back, and I was like, oh, those are probably like lowering springs or something, but they were definitely not made for a 300ZX, like 100% made for like a Porsche 944 or something of that nature. And I slapped those springs on there and lowered that car on some springs, and I to this day do not know what those springs belong to, but somehow they fit. Not perfect, because it rode a little weird, but I remember I had class the day that I was installing the spring, so I went into work super early. I had like an 8 a.m. class. I went to work at like 6 a.m. and started like, you know, I had one of the lifts, and I was installing the rear suspension. I got the rear springs on, and I was like, shoot, I gotta shoot off to class. And so I went to class with the rear suspension installed, lowered, and the front being stock. So I rode down the road with the front end in the air a little bit, and came back later and did the rest of the springs. It didn't sit too bad, and if you're watching my YouTube channel, then you've seen a couple pictures of it that I'm putting up. But yeah, that car was just, it was so much fun, and I broke stuff, and I figured out, what not to do on a lot of things, and then there were some things outside of my expertise. Like something happened with the wiring harness during my time owning that car, and I just couldn't figure it out for the life of me. So I just decided, I was like, I let a Japanese shop, specialized shop, look at it, and they were able to kind of rig something up that worked. I eventually ended up selling it. I can't remember the time frame on how long I had it, maybe 2 years, maybe 3, I can't remember. And probably the longest time I've owned one single vehicle, to be honest with you. And I've had about, me and my brother actually looked at it because we both have had a lot of cars, and we have a list on our phone, but I think I've owned approximately 25 vehicles. I'm 25 years old now, and I think I've owned about 25 vehicles since I was 15 or 16. And yeah, so that car ended up being sold, and obviously, like, I still wanted the Z32 chassis, and so I think it was a couple years. No, it wasn't. It was less than that. I went and I did find a 92 300ZX that was god awful. I mean, it was terrible. This guy was selling it for very cheap. I want to say like $1,200 for a running driving 300ZX, but it was like totaled but not officially totaled, and like he wrecked it but never reported it to insurance, which is obviously a red flag. But the right rear quarter panel was like destroyed, absolutely destroyed, and he bought from a junkyard or something, he like a shell of a Z32 and cut it down the middle, not like half this way, but like from front to back. He cut it, and he had it, and he was like, well, you can have this as well, and you can repair it yourself. He's like, you can just come back another day and pick this up, and you can try to fix it yourself. So I drove it home. It had this terrible misfire. I remember it just didn't sound right, and it was slow, but it was a Z32, and I wanted it so bad, and it had these terrible looking 5-spoke wheels that were, you've never heard of brand wheels, that you probably could buy at AutoZone or something. And that car was not great. I did try to repair it. I cut the quarter panels off both cars and took the good one off that half a car and welded it up and tried my best with that. And then I tried to repair I do remember what happened. I kept this as a keepsake on my shelf in my garage, but I brought it up here just for this. But the misfire I was trying to figure out, and I replaced the spark plugs and it didn't fix it, so I was thinking that it had something to do with the injectors. And if you've ever worked on a VG30 out of a 300ZX and you've seen the intake plenum, which is basically the intake manifold on top of it, it's like a big spider, and it's not as bad as the VH45 out of the Infinity. That's a whole nother topic, but it's quite a task to get that intake manifold off. Anyways, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too far, but basically what happened was I bought a used injector to try to replace that cylinder's injector, thinking that was the right way to go. Little did I know that the injector that I bought was also damaged, probably more so than the one that I already had. And the right way to do it would have been obviously to just get them rebuilt somewhere professionally and then brought back to me. But regardless, you live and you learn. I put that injector in, and I believe that injector was stuck open. And I went to start the car after I put everything back together, and it was just like, dunk, like ooh, boom, and then like everything froze, and the starter would catch the flywheel, and it would not turn over. And the result was this, which I'm holding a bent connecting rod from a VG30, and yeah, it's not supposed to have that nice little, if you turn it sideways, it's a smile. It's, and that's not, or a frown, whichever way you want to look at it. That's not what a connecting rod is supposed to look like. But yeah, I bent the rod in that cylinder because I bought a stuck open injector. And so I learned the hard way on that. So I attempted a motor rebuild on that, but I was unsuccessful. And I can't say that any of that really went well. I tried to build it in my garage, and I made another mistake along the way. And unfortunately, I made a lot of expensive mistakes during my automotive. And I think a lot of people would probably say that, but I've made a lot of expensive mistakes in my automotive lifetime so far. And I later found out, but I rebuilt this motor. Like, I did everything myself, including, like, I had none of the equipment that needed, nor the clean environment to rebuild an engine. But I tried my best, and I rebuilt this engine. I put, like, upgraded pistons. Like, I did the piston rings myself, and everything, like the timing, and it actually, like, it looked really good. Like, I put it all back together, and it looked decent, and, like, the timing was correct and everything. And I thought for sure, I was like, man, like, after all this, regardless of how well I did on some things, it should at least fire and run. But I tried and tried for like a month to get that motor to fire, and it just wouldn't. And at that point, like, I was in too far on that, and I had no money left to spend, and I felt like my only last option was to, like, maybe part out and make some of my money back. So I did. I parted it out, and that car was just basically just like a money pit that ended up being not so great for me. And I loved the car, but it just didn't turn out. That specific one didn't turn out well for me. And I parted out, and I later learned by either looking through the history of what I'd bought for it, but I bought twin turbo head gaskets instead of, like, the naturally aspirated head gaskets, and unfortunately that is a tragic mistake to make. And so I learned the hard way again on that. So anyways, the part out happened, and then I was I can't remember how it happened, but I was friends with, or made acquaintances, however you say that, with a junkyard down the road, and he was willing to pick up that car and take it to his junkyard for free, as long as he could have the car, for the profit of his junkyard. So I did. I got rid of everything. I just had to part ways with it, and I was like, I don't know if I can do it anymore. And I remember during that time too, same junkyard, he came and picked up. I bought a parts car for that white car, or it was white, but the 92 300ZX that I ended up parting out. I bought a fire victim car, a 93 or 4 300ZX parts car for that, and it was just used for parts, but he ended up picking that one up as well. So I got rid of basically everything for that. Fast forward a couple years after I'd owned several different cars and branched out a little bit, and then fast forwarding a couple years, I really wanted to, like, get the 300ZX that I wanted, and not just a crappy one. So I looked on the internet, but the one I really wanted, and the best one, was the slick top. In my opinion, I wanted a slick top, mainly because they're a little bit more uncommon than the T-tops. They made far fewer slick tops than they did for the T-top cars. And I was able to find a guy selling one in South Carolina, and I wanted that car so bad. I paid him like $200 or something just to hold it and to take down the ad. And I was like, dude, I'm coming to get it. I had nobody to go with me. I was like, I'll leave my loaner car up there and come back for it. I just want this particular car. So I did. It was a naturally aspirated. That they didn't make any twin turbo slick tops to my understanding. But he came to me, and I bought it, and man, that car to date is the favorite car I've ever owned. It was a super healthy VG30 inside that car. I took really good care of it. I ended up building it into a track car, which I absolutely loved. That I touched everything but like the long block of that car. Everything was gone through, and I loved that car. It ended up being a fantastic track car, and I got to the point where I was kind of ready for something newer, and I'd been looking at 370Zs, so I ended up selling the slick top after a year or two of ownership, and I loved that car, and I regret selling it to this day. Everybody's got the car. Every car guy's got the car that they watched drive away, and they knew that they were going to regret selling that car, and that was definitely the car for me. But I did end up buying a silver 2009 370Z Sport, which was a blast, and I'm going to do a whole episode on that car because it's a whole story of its own, and I don't want to get stuck down that rabbit trail. But yeah, I had the 370, so I've owned 3 different generations of the Z cars, so I can honestly say that, that first car and that car that I watched across the street growing up definitely influenced my taste in cars over the years, and to this day I love everything about Nissan Z cars and their sports cars, and the racing history and the automotive history, and it's just so cool. And I was actually watching a detailing video on an old Datsun on YouTube just yesterday. But to go back to the beginning of kind of what I was talking about before all this, and I kind of skipped over like a little bit of my intro and my background, but which the Z cars are my background. But I've been doing YouTube for about over 2 years now consistently, and I have had a really great time filming YouTube videos, and it hasn't been 100% as consistent as I would like it to be as far as the content that I've been putting out. But the podcast, I'm striving to make weekly episodes starting excuse me. I need some water. My throat is very dry. Starting in 2021, I'm hoping that the Ratchetdavo podcast will be a weekly episode, and then I will also be trying to put out a different video on the YouTube as well. So if you're coming from podcast platforms and you would like to see my YouTube channel, you can go to Ratchetdavo, Ratchetdavo, one word, Ratchetdavo on YouTube, and we are growing slowly but surely on the YouTube channel, and I'm excited about that. So stay tuned for more videos from the YouTube channel. I am so excited to be doing the podcasting thing now, and to just share anything and everything, my thoughts on the automotive world, and any tips and tricks that I've learned over the years and from the vehicles that I've bought. And at some point I'll have my brother and probably some of my friends come on and talk about some of their automotive experiences. I really truly have some hilarious stories to share, and I just want to save them for different episodes. But as far as this episodes go, and being the first episode, I'm probably going to cut it short and cut it off somewhere around here. I just wanted to kind of share my background and my first car story. And everybody's got a very unique, every car guy I feel like has got a very unique first car story. and mine just happens to be the Z cars, and now that's like my true love in the automotive world. And somebody else has a true passion for Novas, and somebody's probably got a true passion for Crown Vics, and and so on and so forth. But it's so cool that the automotive world and community can come together regardless of the make or model of their vehicles or their backgrounds or anything else, and we can just come together and go to shows and everything like that. I love the automotive community for that, and the racing community as well. And so I've got some cool stories coming up and some cool guests that are going to be on the show. I don't want to give away any hints to anything, but there's some cool content coming for 2021. So definitely follow along for the podcast, subscribe on the YouTube channel, and if you want to see me on social media, I do have a Ratchetdavo Instagram as well, and so you can follow me over there. I really appreciate everybody listening, and I will see everybody in the next episode. Thank you very much.